The Pacific War had begun as a clash of ideologies and empires. It ended as the birth of a new global age. December 7th, 1941, Tokyo, Japan. Morning sunlight spilled across the Imperial Palace moat, the air cool and deceptively calm. From his office in the Navy Ministry's Ata district, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto gazed out the window as the distant hum of celebration rose from the streets below. Banners unfurled, schoolchildren sang patriotic songs, and newspapers declared the dawn of a new age for the empire. The attack on Pearl Harbor had succeeded beyond expectation. 8 American battleships crippled or sunk, over 2,400 dead, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, a tactical triumph that stunned the world. And yet behind his wire-rimmed glasses, Yamamoto's face remained expressionless. The architect of the very plan that electrified his nation sat in silence, unable to share the joy erupting outside. For him, the fireworks over Tokyo marked not victory, but the opening line of a tragedy already written. He knew what few in Japan could yet imagine, that the attack would not end the war swiftly, but ignite a fire that Japan could never extinguish. I fear he had once told close confidants, "We have awakened a sleeping giant," and filled him with a terrible resolve. Though apocryphal in exact wording, the sentiment was genuine. Yamamoto understood the mathematics of war, and they terrified him. He had lived in the United States. He had studied at Harvard University and served as naval attaché in Washington. He had driven past the glowing furnaces of Pittsburgh, where a single American steel mill could outproduce entire regions of Japan. He had stood in the automotive plants of Detroit, where assembly lines moved like clockwork, spitting out thousands of machines each day. He had walked through California's Central Valley, witnessing fields so vast that they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, enough food to feed continents, not just nations. That experience had left an indelible mark. He knew that Japan, for all its martial discipline and courage, lacked the one resource that mattered most in modern war: industrial depth. While his peers obsessed over spirit and honor, Yamamoto thought in supply chains, fuel tonnage, and output ratios. By December 1941, Japan's industrial production amounted to roughly 10% of America's, according to later estimates by the U.S. War Department. Its oil reserves, cut off by U.S. embargoes, could sustain operations for perhaps 18 months. Its steel output, 7.5 million tons, was dwarfed by America's 47 million. Yet his superiors, intoxicated by early conquests in China and Southeast Asia, refused to see the imbalance. In their minds, Japan's surprise attack would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so decisively that America would sue for peace before its industrial machine could awaken. Tokyo's strategists envisioned a short, glorious war-seized territory, fortify it, and negotiate from strength. They were blind to what history would later recognize as their fatal miscalculation, that America's greatest weapon was not its fleet, but its factories. Within hours of the attack, the arithmetic of doom had already begun. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received word of Pearl Harbor while seated in his study. His face tightened, not in fear, but in certainty. He knew the nation would rally as never before. And behind his measured demeanor, America's economic colossus began to stir. Roosevelt's administration, advised by economists and industrialists, began drafting plans that had been quietly prepared for months. Even before the attack, the U.S. had initiated defense mobilization studies anticipating eventual war. Now those blueprints would become orders of national transformation. Just 30 days later, on January 6, 1942, Roosevelt delivered his State of the Union address. To those listening in Congress and over the radio, his words sounded almost impossible. We shall produce 60,000 planes in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. We shall build 45,000 tanks and 75,000 the next year. We shall turn out 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942 and 35,000 the year after. We shall build 6 million tons of shipping this year and 10 million next. These figures were so astronomical that even Japan's military intelligence dismissed them as propaganda. According to captured records after the war, Tokyo's analysts believed Roosevelt's claims were meant to bolster morale, not describe reality. But the data they ignored America's industrial indices, resource stockpiles, and mechanized infrastructure suggested otherwise. In 1941, before full mobilization, Japan had produced roughly 5,000 aircraft. The United States had built nearly 19,000, already 4 times as many. Roosevelt was now promising an increase so vast that it bordered on the mythical 12 times Japan's entire annual aircraft production. At the time, it seemed inconceivable. Yet Roosevelt's speech was no fantasy. It was a declaration of economic warfare backed by a mobilization plan that economists today still call the most rapid industrial expansion in human history. Within 6 months, those promises began turning into numbers. America's War Production Board, created in January 1942 and led by former Sears executive Donald Nelson, began redirecting the entire civilian economy toward war. Civilian automobile production ceased by February. By March, plants in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago had been converted to military output. Factories that once built sedans now turned out tanks and aircraft engines. The process was chaotic but effective and, above all, fast. By the end of 1942, U.S. aircraft production had reached 47,000, falling short of Roosevelt's goal, but still achieving an unprecedented 10-fold advantage over Japan. The following year would nearly double that figure. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan's war planners continued operating under the illusion of superiority. They saw America as undisciplined, its citizens too soft, too divided, too individualistic to endure the rigors of total war. They misread democracy as weakness, a critical failure of cultural intelligence that historians now consider as decisive as any battle. In truth, Roosevelt's mobilization had unified the American population with a sense of shared purpose unmatched in its history. Unemployment vanished almost overnight. By mid-1942, 18 million Americans were employed in defense-related industries. Women filled factory floors. African Americans entered industrial roles previously denied to them, and the elderly returned to work. From the foundries of Pennsylvania to the shipyards of California, an entire society became an engine of war. What Yamamoto foresaw in dread was now becoming reality. In 6 months, America was transforming from an industrial power into a war-making civilization. In Tokyo, reports from Japan's naval attachés in Washington and San Francisco began arriving: production graphs, steel consumption figures, shipyard output. Some dismissed them as exaggerations. Others simply ignored them. But in his private letters, Yamamoto no longer doubted the truth. The arithmetic was turning against Japan faster than he had feared, and on the horizon, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that arithmetic would find its proof in a place called Midway. January 1942, Washington, D.C. The ink from President Roosevelt's State of the Union address had barely dried when the machinery of total mobilization began roaring to life. Across the American continent, civilian life was being rewritten overnight. Factories that had built refrigerators, radios, and automobiles were stripped down and rebuilt to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and artillery. A country that had been producing consumer goods for a peacetime population now shifted toward an all-encompassing war economy, something no democracy had ever attempted on such a scale. The newly established War Production Board, WPB, led by Donald Nelson, became the nerve center of this transformation. Nelson, a former retail executive, was no soldier, yet his command over America's industrial destiny was almost dictatorial. The War Powers Act gave him authority to redirect raw materials, seize plants, and prioritize contracts. In practice, this meant that within weeks, the American private sector was no longer guided by the invisible hand of the market, but by the iron fist of necessity. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard companies that had defined American consumer life now became engines of war. At the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, Ford engineers designed a facility so massive it could be seen from the edge of the Great Lakes. Its assembly lines, modeled on the techniques that once produced cars, now built B-24 Liberator bombers, one every 63 minutes at the plant's 1944 peak. This single factory would produce more bombers than the entire Japanese aircraft industry could build in a year. Within 64 days of Pearl Harbor, General Motors produced its last civilian car, a Chevrolet sedan, and retooled for tank production by midnight the same day. By spring, the same assembly lines that had symbolized American leisure were churning out the tools of total war. It was an unprecedented conversion, both logistical and psychological. Economists of the time described the process as controlled chaos. Thousands of subcontractors had to be reorganized. Raw material allocations, steel, copper, aluminum, rubber, were rationed by the WPB. But the results stunned even those who designed the system. Production statistics that had seemed like fantasy in Roosevelt's January speech began to take physical form by March. In Seattle, Boeing's workforce grew from 4,000 to 30,000 in less than 3 years. Douglas Aircraft expanded so quickly that entire new towns had to be built to house workers. Shipyards in Richmond, California, operated by Henry Kaiser, built cargo ships in mere weeks, an achievement so astounding that one Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was launched just 4 days and 15 hours after construction began. The stunt intended as propaganda nevertheless proved a point. America's capacity for mobilization was not theoretical. It was operational. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence officers monitoring these reports could scarcely believe them. Intercepts of American press coverage translated for the Imperial General Staff were dismissed as exaggerations. In their worldview, no democracy could mobilize with such speed. The Americans, wrote one Japanese analyst in February 1942, are a people who live for comfort. They will tire of war before their machines are ready. They were catastrophically wrong. The truth was that the United States, once roused, was demonstrating a level of national unity that authoritarian regimes like Japan's could never replicate. The sociologist Charles E. Merriam, advising the War Department, observed that a free society's consent is a more powerful engine than any command economy. Factories competed to exceed quotas. Citizens bought war bonds, not out of coercion, but pride. In a single week in 1942, bond drives raised enough money to fund the construction of 100 warships. The speed of this industrial metamorphosis defied historical precedent. In just 6 months, the U.S. had achieved an output that surpassed the entire Axis war machine in some categories. Aircraft production alone increased by 145% between January and June 1942. Steel production reached 88 million tons, nearly double Japan's pre-war total. American shipyards launched vessels faster than the Japanese Navy could sink them. The industrial mobilization was also a social revolution. Women previously excluded from heavy industry entered factories in unprecedented numbers. Before the war, they made up less than 1% of aviation workers. By mid-1942, that figure exceeded 10%. By 1943, it had tripled. Rosie the Riveter was not just a poster, she was a national phenomenon. In Seattle, women riveted fuselages for Boeing. In Baltimore, they welded Liberty ships. In Detroit, they drove cranes and assembled tank engines. African Americans, long marginalized from industrial labor, also entered defense work in record numbers. Executive Order 8802, signed by Roosevelt in June 1941, had prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industry, a measure born of political necessity, but destined to alter American society permanently. By 1945, over 1 million Black Americans worked in defense plants, earning wages and technical experience that would lay the foundation for the civil rights movement. Teenagers, retirees, and disabled individuals joined the workforce too. Factories operated day and night, running 3 shifts, 7 days a week. By 1944, 18 million Americans were working in defense industries, 1 in every 7 citizens. The scale of this labor mobilization bewildered Japanese observers. A classified Imperial Navy report in late 1942 described the phenomenon as a miracle of machines and people. But there was no miracle, only mathematics, organization, and will. For Japan, the contrast was devastating. Its production facilities were specialized and brittle, incapable of rapid adaptation. Aircraft factories built only aircraft, shipyards built only ships. When bombed, they could not be replaced quickly. When fuel ran short, assembly stopped entirely. America's decentralized, flexible industrial base, by contrast, could reassign resources with astonishing speed. Even as America's output soared, Japan's remained stagnant. In 1942, Japan produced about 5,000 aircraft, roughly the same as the year before. The U.S. produced 47,000. By the following year, that figure reached 85,000 more aircraft than existed in the world a decade earlier. This disparity was not simply quantitative. It represented 2 different philosophies of warfare. Japan's military still operated on 19th century principles: courage, precision, and spirit. America was pioneering a 20th century doctrine, logistics as destiny. The War Production Board's chairman, Donald Nelson, captured it bluntly in his 1943 report to Congress. "We are not winning because we are braver. We are winning because we can build faster, and what we build, we can replace." That replacement cycle, the ability to absorb losses without strategic collapse, became the true foundation of American military superiority. Meanwhile, Japan's high command continued to live inside illusions. Their belief in American weakness bordered on theological. Army planners insisted that Yamato spirit could overcome material inferiority, even as reports from the front lines hinted at disaster from the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942. Tokyo's war ministry doubled down on the myth of invincibility, but beneath the euphoria, cracks were forming. Officers like Minoru Genda, one of the Pearl Harbor tacticians, began recording private doubts. In his March 1942 diary, he wrote, "We achieved tactical surprise, but ensured strategic defeat. The Americans are not collapsing, they are building." Genda would soon be reassigned for defeatist thinking. In the Pacific skies, the mathematics of attrition were already working against Japan. Every aircraft lost, every pilot killed, every ship sunk represented an irreplaceable blow. For America, each loss was a temporary inconvenience, another order in the production pipeline. For Japan, it was permanent subtraction. The reckoning was coming. And by the early summer of 1942, that reckoning had a name: Midway. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's private prophecy would unfold with mathematical precision. The empire that believed it could end the war in months was about to face the industrial and informational power of a nation that had only just begun to fight. May 1942. In the corridors of Tokyo's Naval General Staff headquarters, tension simmered beneath a facade of confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy had achieved victory after victory across Asia and the Pacific, from the Philippines to Malaya, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies. Maps in Tokyo glowed red with conquests, and newspapers called it the 8-month miracle. Yet among the senior officers, a different emotion lurked, the creeping realization that Japan's triumphs had reached their zenith. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had always known this moment would come. He had warned the Prime Minister privately, "If ordered to fight, I can guarantee success for 6 months. After that, I have no confidence." It had been 6 months since Pearl Harbor, and the storm he foresaw was forming beyond the horizon. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May 1942, offered the first sign that the tide was turning. Japan's attempt to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, a stepping stone toward cutting Australia off from Allied support, was halted by a combined U.S.-Australian task force. Though tactically inconclusive, the strategic outcome was undeniable. Japan's advance had been stopped cold. For the first time in modern history, 2 opposing fleets had fought without their ships ever seeing each other, carrier aircraft deciding the battle from hundreds of miles away. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and saw the fleet carrier Shokaku heavily damaged. More devastating, however, were the human losses: 90 aircraft and 77 of Japan's best naval aviators. To an outsider, those numbers might seem small, but to Japan, whose pilot training pipeline required years of preparation and emphasized quality over quantity, it was a blow from which they would never fully recover. Each lost pilot represented irreplaceable skill honed through thousands of flight hours. Replacing 77 combat-experienced airmen could take 12 to 18 months, and Japan no longer had that kind of time. Across the Pacific, the American calculation was brutally simple. As one analyst in Washington wrote that spring, "We lose planes. We replace them. Japan loses pilots. She replaces none." Even before the Coral Sea engagement, Yamamoto had been preparing for the operation that he believed could still force the United States to the negotiating table, the invasion of Midway Atoll. His logic was clear. By luring the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and destroying its remaining carriers, Japan could cripple America's ability to project power westward. The plan was elegant on paper, an ambush wrapped inside deception, but it was also based on a fatal assumption that the Americans were unaware of his intentions. They weren't. In a dimly lit basement beneath a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, a small team of cryptanalysts known as Station HYPO had been quietly deciphering Japan's most secure naval code, JN-25. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort and linguist Edwin Layton, these analysts were piecing together fragments of intercepted messages to reconstruct Japanese operational plans. By late May, they had cracked a critical portion of the code-repeated references to an upcoming operation at a location designated AF. Through a clever deception sending a fake radio message that Midway's water plant had broken down, the Americans confirmed that AF referred to Midway itself. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, devised a counter-ambush. He positioned 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway, lying in wait. The Japanese fleet led by Yamamoto himself believed they were the hunters. In reality, they were sailing straight into a trap. June 4, 1942, dawn. Japanese reconnaissance planes swept over Midway, reporting calm seas and clear weather, ideal conditions for attack. At 4:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese bombers launched roaring toward the atoll. Within hours, explosions lit the sky above the small coral island. Fuel depots ignited, hangars burned, and anti-aircraft fire peppered the clouds. To the Japanese strike leader, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, it seemed like another flawless operation. But while the Japanese fleet was still rearming for a second strike, confusion began to spread. Reports of American ships to the northeast reached Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force. His dilemma was immediate and fatal. Should he prepare his planes for a second land attack on Midway, or rearm them with torpedoes for an unexpected naval engagement? He hesitated, and in those precious minutes, destiny shifted. Below decks, Japanese crews scrambled in panic to replace bombs with torpedoes, mixing live ordnance and aviation fuel in an explosive cocktail of chaos. On the flight decks above aircraft waited fully fueled their engines idling. It was a scene of lethal vulnerability and precisely the window the Americans needed. At 7:00 a.m., radar operators on Midway detected multiple inbound formations 175 miles out, approaching from 325 degrees. The battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific had begun. From the Enterprise and Hornet, American torpedo squadrons launched first slow, outdated aircraft flying barely above the waves. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, charged directly into a storm of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Without fighter escort, every plane was shot down. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Waldron and his entire squadron were lost, but their sacrifice accomplished something extraordinary. The Japanese fighter cover over 30 Zeros descended to sea level to intercept the torpedo bombers, leaving the skies above temporarily undefended. Moments later, from 14,000 feet, American dive bombers appeared out of the sun. At 10:20 a.m., led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, they began their attack. In the span of 5 minutes, everything changed. The American bombs fell with deadly precision, striking the Akagi Kaga and Soryu. Fuel lines ruptured. Decks erupted in fire. Munitions detonated in chain reactions that tore through the ship's hulls. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, the same vessels that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were burning ruins. Hours later, the 4th Hiryu managed to launch a counterstrike that crippled the Yorktown. But by sunset, American planes found Hiryu and delivered the final blow. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed. Japan lost 248 aircraft, over 3,000 men, and more devastatingly, the majority of its elite carrier pilots. The loss was irreplaceable. The United States, by contrast, lost the Yorktown and a destroyer. It was a costly victory, but strategically, it changed everything. The Battle of Midway was more than a naval engagement. It was the collapse of Japan's strategic illusion. The myth of Japanese invincibility built on speed and precision shattered in 5 minutes of chaos. The empire that had thought to end the war in months now faced a war it could never win. For Yamamoto, who received the battle's outcome aboard his flagship Yamato, the message was devastatingly brief. 3 carriers lost, situation critical. He read it twice in silence, then removed his glasses, his face unreadable. Later that evening, he reportedly said, "The war has been decided by fate." But it wasn't fate. It was mathematics, the cold arithmetic of production, logistics, and intelligence. While Japan could build a handful of new carriers in the next 3 years, America would build 17. For every lost aircraft, America would build 10 more. For every pilot killed, 10 new aviators would graduate from flight schools operating around the clock. The giant Yamamoto feared had indeed awakened, and it was already unstoppable. The defeat at Midway sent shockwaves through the Japanese Empire, a psychological and strategic earthquake that shattered the illusion of invincibility that had carried Tokyo through the first 6 months of war. In public official announcements, downplayed the disaster. The loss of several ships, vague references to damage sustained. But within the corridors of the Imperial General Staff, the truth was undeniable. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The very heart of Japan's naval air power had been destroyed. More than 3,000 sailors and aviators were gone, many of them veterans who had trained since the 1930s. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, whose reputation as a military genius had shielded him from criticism, faced the grim arithmetic he had long feared. In a war of attrition, Japan could not win. "Our fate was sealed at Midway," one of his surviving officers later said. "After that day, we fought only to delay the inevitable." But for the United States, Midway was not just a victory, it was proof of concept. It validated everything that America's war planners, engineers, and industrialists had bet on, that production logistics and intelligence could outmatch any empire's discipline or spirit. The outcome wasn't luck. It was the logical result of a mobilization effort already operating at full throttle. By the summer of 1942, America's industrial output had entered a realm previously thought impossible. Across the nation, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, factories pulsed with life. Assembly lines that once built typewriters now produced machine guns. Rail car manufacturers turned out tank hulls. Toy companies made precision bomb sights. Every cog of the civilian economy had been repurposed for war. The scale was staggering. In 1942 alone, U.S. industry produced 47,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and over 50,000 artillery pieces. Japan, despite mobilizing its entire economy, managed a fraction of that, roughly 5,000 aircraft, and 200 tanks. The disparity was not just numerical, but philosophical. Japan still waged war in the 19th century mold, courage, speed, surprise, while the United States was pioneering 20th century warfare, systematic, industrial, and data-driven. To the Japanese high command, this was incomprehensible. In their worldview, democracy was weak, individualism was corrosive, and a free market economy was too chaotic for war. Yet America's decentralized system, a fusion of private initiative and government coordination, proved the opposite. The War Production Board didn't command obedience through fear. It inspired cooperation through competition. Corporations were not nationalized, but incentivized. Success was rewarded. The result was the most efficient wartime economy in history. Consider the transformation of Detroit, the city once called the automobile capital of the world. By mid-1942, it had become the arsenal of democracy. Chrysler built tank engines. Ford's Willow Run plant rolled out bombers faster than Japan could replace the planes lost at Midway. General Motors produced more military vehicles than the entire Axis combined. Meanwhile, in California, the Boeing plant in Seattle and Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica expanded beyond recognition. Entire new towns were built around them. In a single year, Boeing's workforce increased sevenfold. By 1944, American factories were producing a new aircraft every 5 minutes. Shipyards told a similar story. In Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser's shipbuilding empire employed over 90,000 workers, many of them women and minorities. The Liberty Ship program, conceived to solve the logistical nightmare of global war, was producing cargo vessels in mere weeks. At its peak, the United States launched 3 ships a day, a number that left Japanese naval intelligence in disbelief. A report captured by Allied forces after the war revealed the mindset that doomed Japan's planners. It read, "The enemy's industrial reports are likely exaggerated. It is impossible for a free people with divided interests to achieve such unity of production." The report was dated August 1942, 2 months after Midway. By then, America's industrial unity was already undeniable. Behind these statistics lay the beating heart of the American home front, the ordinary men and women whose collective effort turned factories into arsenals. Women in bandanas and denim overalls riveted fuselages and welded ship hulls. African Americans found new opportunities in industries that had once excluded them. High school students worked part-time in machine shops. Retirees returned to factories to train the next generation of workers. The result was an economy that seemed to defy gravity, growing even as it waged war. By contrast, Japan's industrial foundation was rigid, centralized, and brittle. Its factories relied on imported materials, iron from Manchuria, oil from the Dutch East Indies, bauxite from the Philippines. Every ship sunk by an American submarine cut another artery of supply. As early as 1943, Japan's petroleum output had collapsed by 75%. Synthetic substitutes extracted from pine roots and coal tar proved disastrously inefficient. Fighter planes sat grounded for lack of fuel. Training flights were canceled. The economic asymmetry now defined the war's tempo. For every American pilot who crashed, a replacement graduated within weeks. For every ship Japan lost, America built 10 more. The empire's once mighty fleet was shrinking faster than its factories could replace it. In Washington, this imbalance was quantified in charts and graphs, visual testaments to what historians later called the mathematics of victory. President Roosevelt's planners understood that modern war was no longer decided by battlefield heroics alone. It was a contest of steel, oil, and logistics, and in those categories America was untouchable. The Japanese government, blinded by pride, refused to face this reality. In cabinet meetings, military leaders spoke of divine spirit and racial destiny. They dismissed intelligence reports showing America's rising production as propaganda. But behind closed doors, some officers admitted what the numbers made clear. One colonel, writing anonymously in his wartime diary, confessed, "The Americans have factories instead of gods, and it seems their gods do not sleep." By late 1942, Japan's confidence was cracking. The disaster at Midway was followed by the Guadalcanal campaign, the first sustained ground offensive against Japanese forces. For 6 months, brutal fighting drained men, planes, and ships from an already overextended empire. Japanese logistics broke down completely. Food spoiled on docks, ammunition shipments vanished beneath the waves. Each week, Allied submarines sank more Japanese merchant ships, choking off vital resources. The United States, meanwhile, expanded its submarine fleet to over 200 vessels. By war's end, those submarines would destroy more than 60% of Japan's merchant shipping and 30% of its navy, effectively starving the empire. The lesson of Midway was now manifesting everywhere. Information and industry were the new weapons of war. Japan had lost not just 4 carriers, it had lost the initiative, the ability to control the tempo of conflict. From this point onward, Japan could only react, never dictate, and Yamamoto, the man who had warned them, knew it. After Midway, he retreated into silence, burdened by the knowledge that his own brilliance had hastened Japan's downfall. In April 1943, while traveling to boost morale among troops in the Solomon Islands, his plane was intercepted by American fighters who had decrypted his itinerary using the same code-breaking methods that had doomed him at Midway. His transport was shot down. Yamamoto died instantly. The empire buried him as a martyr. But history would remember him differently, as a man who saw the truth too early and was powerless to stop it. His prophecy had come true. Japan had fought bravely for 6 months, and now the long, inevitable decline had begun. The sleeping giant was awake, and it would not rest until the empire that struck Pearl Harbor lay in ashes. By the beginning of 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new phase, one defined not by surprise attacks or bold offensives, but by the relentless grind of industrial might versus dwindling resources. For Japan, the tempo of war had slowed to a crawl. For the United States, it was accelerating into overdrive. Everywhere the contrast was visible. American shipyards were launching destroyers and escort vessels faster than the Imperial Navy could sink them. Aircraft factories in California and Michigan worked under floodlights that turned night into day. Meanwhile, Japan's once mighty arsenal, the product of decades of meticulous craftsmanship and imperial pride, was beginning to crumble under the pressure of mathematics. The Battle of Guadalcanal, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, illustrated this imbalance vividly. The Japanese fought with ferocity and skill, often winning local engagements and inflicting heavy casualties. But the Americans fought with logistics. Every week the U.S. Navy delivered fresh troops, food, and ammunition to the island. Japan could not. Its supply lines were stretched thin, vulnerable to American submarines and aircraft. Soldiers on Guadalcanal fought half-starved, drinking swamp water and dying of malaria. When the final evacuation came, Japan had lost more than 25,000 men, irreplaceable veterans sacrificed to a war of attrition they could never win. The numbers told the story of an empire bleeding itself dry. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, already strained, began to collapse under the weight of American air raids and submarine warfare. By the end of 1943, Japan had lost over half of its merchant fleet, and replacement rates lagged far behind destruction. Even before the U.S. firebombing campaigns began, Japan's economy was already collapsing from internal starvation. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was producing abundance on a scale that astonished even its own allies. In 1943 alone, American factories built 85,000 aircraft, including fighters, bombers, transports, and reconnaissance planes. Japan produced barely 28,000, most of them older designs, that could not match the latest American technology. This imbalance was more than material, it was philosophical. The Japanese mindset had always revered precision craftsmanship and technical mastery. Their Zero fighter, for example, was a marvel of lightweight engineering, agile, elegant, and deadly in skilled hands. But that same devotion to perfection limited mass production. Each aircraft required skilled artisans and hand-fitted components. The Americans, by contrast, built for scale. The P-51 Mustang and F-6F Hellcat were not works of art, they were machines of replication. Built quickly, repaired, easily, replaced, endlessly. Japan's obsession with perfection became its curse. America's embrace of good enough, built fast, became its superpower. And nowhere was this more evident than in the shipyards of the U.S. Navy. Between 1942 and 1945, American yards launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels, from massive aircraft carriers to small landing craft. Japan, despite its early lead in carrier warfare, produced fewer than 1,000 during the entire war. The Essex-class carriers, which began entering service in 1943, embodied this industrial supremacy, displacing 33,000 tons, capable of carrying 100 aircraft and equipped with advanced radar and damage control systems. These floating air bases were both powerful and replaceable. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, managed to complete only 6 new fleet carriers after Midway. Each one was smaller, slower, and increasingly short of aircraft and trained pilots. For every Japanese carrier that entered service, America launched 3. For every Japanese destroyer completed, America launched 5. And for every Japanese submarine commissioned, America built 1 that could stay at sea longer, dive deeper, and strike harder. The cumulative effect was devastating. By 1943, the once proud Imperial Japanese Navy was fighting outnumbered in every category that mattered. Even when Japan fielded excellent ships like the superb Yamato-class battleships, the largest ever built, their strategic value was negligible. Yamato herself, bristling with 18-inch guns and armor, thicker than any rival, spent most of the war idle, unable to find fuel or air cover sufficient to protect her. The age of the battleship was over. The age of industrialized air power had begun. American planners understood this perfectly. Japan did not. Back in Washington, the U.S. War Department's Operations Division had begun analyzing the war as an equation. Reports circulated through the Pentagon under the title Victory Through Production. These documents reduced war to a science tables of ship tonnage, fuel allocation, bomb load efficiency, and output per worker. To Japanese strategists raised on the ethos of the samurai, such analysis seemed soulless. To American strategists, it was salvation. One 1943 study from the Office of War Mobilization concluded that the United States could lose the equivalent of an entire fleet and still maintain superiority in all theaters. Japan, it noted, bluntly, could not lose a single carrier without strategic collapse. It was no exaggeration. The imbalance in resources was staggering. America's access to oil, steel, and aluminum dwarfed Japan's by factors of 10 or more. U.S. petroleum output reached nearly 200 million barrels per year. Japan's entire empire produced barely 5% of that. The United States controlled over half the world's aluminum reserves essential for aircraft production, while Japan relied on imported bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, often interrupted by Allied submarines. And while Japanese workers toiled in blackout conditions, American workers labored under the glow of floodlights powered by abundant electricity and fed by an agricultural system that not only sustained the home front, but supplied Britain, China, and even the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. Japan's problem was not just scarcity, it was strategy. Tokyo's leaders continued to fight as if courage could replace coal or discipline could substitute for diesel. Their faith in the Yamato spirit blinded them to a truth that Yamamoto had foreseen years before war in the 20th century was no longer a contest of bravery. It was a contest of output. By late 1943, the gap between American production and Japanese attrition had become irreparable. For every Japanese aircraft destroyed, America produced 10 replacements. For every Japanese ship sunk, American shipyards launched 15. The U.S. Navy's submarine blockade combined with strategic bombing turned Japan's war economy into an hourglass with sand rapidly running out. Tokyo knew it, even if it refused to admit it. Internal memoranda from Japan's Ministry of Munitions, declassified after the war, paint a picture of desperation engineers begging for more fuel factories, cannibalizing wrecked aircraft for spare parts, and pilots being trained on wooden mock-ups, because real planes could no longer be spared for instruction. In contrast, America's flight schools operated 24 hours a day. By 1944, they were graduating 10,000 new pilots every month, a number larger than Japan's entire operational air force. The human cost of this imbalance became brutally clear in the skies over the Pacific. American pilots entered combat with 250 hours of flight training. Japanese rookies by late 1944 often had fewer than 100. The result was massacre, especially as newer American aircraft, like the F-6F Hellcat and P-51 Mustang, entered service combining superior speed armor and firepower with sheer numerical dominance. By the time the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted in June 1944, 2 years after Midway, the outcome was predetermined. Japanese carrier pilots, once the most elite aviators in the world, faced radar-guided formations of American fighters flying from Essex-class carriers. The result was annihilation. In a single day, Japan lost more than 600 aircraft, its entire naval air arm, in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The loss was more than tactical. It was existential. For Japan, the skies had become unwinnable, the seas uncontrollable, and the war unwinnable. And yet the empire fought on, because surrender in their culture was unthinkable. But in America, the mood was changing too, from vengeance to inevitability. Roosevelt's planners no longer asked if Japan would fall, but how soon and at what human cost. In 6 months, Yamamoto's prophecy had come true. In 2 years, it had become prophecy fulfilled by numbers. The war's final phase, from the burning skies over Tokyo to the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would be defined not by tactics, but by industrial and scientific supremacy that no empire could resist. By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered its final and most devastating stage, the phase where American industrial power translated directly into overwhelming military dominance. The tide that had turned at Midway was now an unstoppable flood. Every island, every convoy, every engagement bore the same signature precision logistics, numerical superiority, and a flow of resources that Japan could no longer even attempt to match. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff still issued orders filled with confidence and imperial rhetoric. Official communiques spoke of strategic withdrawals and temporary setbacks, but inside the War Ministry's reports grew more desperate by the week. Japan's shipping losses had reached catastrophic levels. By the beginning of 1944, the empire had lost nearly 3 million tons of merchant shipping, half of its pre-war capacity. By the end of the year, another 2.5 million tons would be gone, victims of American submarines prowling the Pacific. Every ton of shipping lost meant less food, less oil, less ammunition. The arteries that sustained Japan's empire, stretching from Borneo's oil fields to the rice paddies of Indochina, were being cut one by one. American submarines operating with new radar and acoustic torpedoes hunted Japanese merchant convoys relentlessly. By 1945, Japan's imports of oil and raw materials had fallen by over 90%. Factories still stood, but they had no fuel to run their machines. Meanwhile, American industry operated at levels that stunned even its allies. In 1944, U.S. factories produced 96,000 aircraft, 28,000 tanks, and over 60,000 naval guns. These figures were not propaganda. They were reality verified by independent production audits. The War Production Board's centralized planning, coupled with private industry's innovation, had created what historians later called a war economy without collapse. This was a feat that no other nation, not Germany, not Britain, not the Soviet Union, had achieved. The U.S. was fighting on 2 oceans, supplying multiple allies, and still managing to expand its gross national product by over 70% compared to 1941. Civilian consumption remained high. Unemployment was virtually eliminated. It was total war without social breakdown. For the Japanese leadership, these numbers were incomprehensible. Military doctrine still preached that spiritual superiority could overcome material inferiority. "The American is a machine," one Japanese admiral said in 1944. "He does not fight from the heart." But the Americans didn't need to. Their machines, their tanks, ships, and planes fought for them. The transformation of the U.S. Navy was the most visible expression of this power. At the start of the war, the Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. By 1944, it was the most powerful naval force in human history. 17 Essex-class carriers, supported by fast battleships and hundreds of destroyers, dominated the seas from the Marshall Islands to the Philippines. Each carrier could launch 100 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses, operating in coordinated task forces that could strike anywhere, anytime. By contrast, Japan's carrier fleet was a shadow of its former self. The loss of experienced pilots at Midway and the Marianas Turkey Shoot had gutted the air wings of every surviving carrier. Replacement pilots were barely trained. Some had logged fewer than 50 hours of flight time. Their aircraft were often outdated, underpowered, and made of inferior materials as Japan struggled with aluminum shortages. Even when Japanese forces managed to field new designs like the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden or the Nakajima Ki 84 Hayate, they were produced in quantities too small to matter. Many never reached combat units due to fuel shortages or bombing damage to transport infrastructure. American pilots flying from massive air bases across the Pacific encountered these planes only sporadically and in numbers that never threatened air superiority. The war had become asymmetrical beyond redemption. America was fighting with factories. Japan was fighting with hope. The disparity extended beyond weapons to logistics, the invisible science that decides modern wars. American forces could move hundreds of thousands of troops across oceans, supported by floating supply chains of oilers' repair ships and hospital vessels. When the U.S. Navy seized an island, it immediately constructed airfields, fuel depots, and docks capable of supporting the next advance. Each captured island became a launch pad for the next offensive like stepping stones across the Pacific. Japan had no equivalent system. Its supply lines were static, vulnerable, and easily severed. Once an island was cut off, its defenders were doomed. Japanese garrisons on isolated islands like Rabaul and Truk were effectively abandoned, starving in place, their existence reduced to survival rather than defense. In this context, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 marked the death of Japan's carrier aviation. In just 2 days, over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed along with 3 carriers. American losses totaled fewer than 30 planes. The disparity was so extreme that U.S. pilots grimly nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. After that, Japan's carriers became little more than floating decoys, unable to launch effective strikes, used instead to lure American ships into traps that never materialized. The last vestige of Japanese naval power died at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. At Leyte, the Imperial Navy deployed every remaining major vessel in a desperate attempt to halt the American invasion of the Philippines. What followed was annihilation. 4 Japanese carriers, 9 battleships, and 19 cruisers were sunk, more than half of Japan's remaining surface fleet. American losses were comparatively light. From that moment onward, Japan's navy ceased to exist as an offensive force. The consequences were immediate and apocalyptic. The loss of the Philippines cut Japan's oil lifeline from the Dutch East Indies. Without fuel, ships could not sail, planes could not fly, and armies could not move. By 1945, Japan was functionally besieged. Cities went dark at night due to power shortages. Transportation collapsed. Civilians scavenged for charcoal to cook food. Rice rations fell below starvation levels. Industrial output, which had peaked in 1941, plummeted to less than 20% of pre-war capacity. Yet, in America, the engine of war only roared louder. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber ever built, had entered service. Each one cost the equivalent of $3 million in 1940s dollars, used 35,000 parts, and could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs across 3,000 miles. Boeing's production lines in Kansas and Washington were turning out B-29s faster than Japan could shoot them down. These bombers would become the instruments of Japan's final undoing. From newly captured airfields in the Mariana Islands, American bombers began striking the Japanese homeland directly. Initially, high-altitude precision raids achieved mixed results due to winds and weather. But in March 1945, General Curtis LeMay changed tactics, switching to low-altitude nighttime incendiary attacks. The results were catastrophic. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, 334 B-29s dropped nearly 1,700 tons of firebombs on Tokyo. The result was a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the city and killed an estimated 100,000 people, more than the casualties of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Entire districts were reduced to ash. The smell of burning wood and flesh carried for miles. Over the next months, LeMay's bombers repeated the pattern across Japan's major cities: Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. By the summer of 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been systematically destroyed. Civilian casualties exceeded 500,000 and millions were left homeless. Still, the imperial government refused to surrender. The military leadership clung to delusion that perhaps America would agree to a negotiated peace if Japan could inflict one last costly battle on the beaches of Kyushu or Honshu. They were preparing for an invasion that would never come. Because America's scientists, working in secrecy thousands of miles away, had already built a weapon that would render invasion unnecessary. The Manhattan Project, employing over 130,000 people across facilities in Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, had succeeded in creating the atomic bomb, the ultimate manifestation of industrial science and state coordination. It was the logical endpoint of the same industrial philosophy that had built Liberty ships and Essex carriers: coordination, standardization, and scale. The war that began with precision attacks from the air at Pearl Harbor would end with the most devastating air attack in history. The question now was not whether Japan would lose. It was how, and how completely. August 6, 1945. The morning was clear over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay flew high above the city, unnoticed by most on the ground. A bright flash, a silent bloom of light, and then, in less than 1 second, the heart of the city was vaporized. A column of fire rose nearly 10 kilometers into the sky. Beneath it, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were gone, erased in a burst of heat that reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The bombs, codenamed Little Boy and Fat Man, were not just weapons. They were the culmination of an era, the perfect fusion of science industry and military necessity. And their use signaled that the age of industrial warfare had reached its ultimate expression. In less than 1 generation, humanity had evolved from propeller-driven dogfights over Pearl Harbor to atomic annihilation from the stratosphere. The same system that had produced millions of planes, ships, and tanks had now produced something that rendered all of them obsolete. For Japan, there was nothing left to fight for. The empire that had once sought to dominate Asia now faced extinction. Yet even after Hiroshima, Japan's military council hesitated. Some generals insisted the nation fight to the end. Others believed surrender would be a betrayal of their ancestors. Emperor Hirohito, long silent throughout the war, faced a decision no ruler in Japan's history had ever made to break with the code of death before dishonor. It took Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's sudden invasion of Manchuria on August 9th to shatter the illusion completely. The final blow was not just physical, but psychological. The Japanese high command realized that even if they fought on their cities, their food, their fuel, and now their very existence could be erased at will. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice reached the Japanese people for the first time in history. Crackling through the static of radio speakers, his words were both formal and devastating. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation. For the first time, the Japanese people heard their emperor speak, not as a divine figure commanding war, but as a man surrendering to survival. The American response was not jubilation, but exhaustion. Cities across the United States erupted in celebration, yes, but behind the confetti and cheers lay an awareness of what had been required. In just under 4 years, the United States had mobilized over 16 million personnel, produced 300,000 aircraft, 90,000 tanks, and 70,000 ships. The war had cost over 400,000 American lives, but it had also transformed the nation into the most powerful industrial and military force on Earth. Japan, by contrast, had lost over 3 million people, soldiers, sailors, and civilians. Its cities were rubble, its industry erased. Once the most formidable naval power in the Pacific, it now had no navy at all. Once it had envisioned an empire stretching from India to Hawaii. Now it was a nation struggling to feed its own population. The true defeat, however, was not just material. It was ideological. The war had proven beyond doubt that industrial capacity, science, and logistics, not spiritual purity or nationalist myth, decided the fate of nations in the modern age. The United States had redefined warfare as a problem of production and information. Japan had tried to wage it as a matter of will and sacrifice, and in that clash of philosophies, willpower burned bright but industry endured. In the aftermath, America faced a new question. What now? The atomic bomb had ended the war, but it had also opened a door to something new an era of total potential annihilation. As General Dwight Eisenhower later observed, "The same engines of war that saved us could also destroy us." Historians would later call this moment the pivot of the century. The war that began with surprise with Japan's audacious attack on Pearl Harbor ended with scientific inevitability. It was in every sense the story of a race between two civilizations, one defined by faith in destiny, the other by mastery of production. In Japan's ashes, the lesson was unmistakable. Courage could not overcome chemistry. Spirit could not outfly steel. The devotion of millions of soldiers could not defeat the assembly line. And yet from those ashes rose a new kind of empire, one built not on conquest, but on reconstruction. Under the American occupation, Japan's economy was rebuilt under the supervision of General Douglas MacArthur. The policies that once fueled total war, centralized planning, high discipline industrial coordination, were redirected toward peaceful production. The same factories that had built Zero fighters and torpedoes now built automobiles and radios. The same engineers who had once studied ways to destroy American bombers were now improving precision machining electronics and optics. Within a generation, Japan would become an industrial powerhouse, again not through domination, but through reinvention. It was the greatest irony of the war. The country that had once fought to reject Western modernization would become its most brilliant student. By the 1960s, Japan's manufacturing efficiency rivaled that of its former conqueror. By the 1980s, it led in electronics and automobiles, exporting not destruction, but innovation. In this, too, the spirit of Yamamoto's warning lived on. He had feared awakening a sleeping giant. But what neither he nor Roosevelt could have imagined was that Japan itself, once defeated, would rise to mirror that giant, not as an enemy, but as an ally. The transformation was so complete that within a few decades the U.S. and Japan were no longer adversaries. They were strategic partners shaping a new Pacific order. The carriers that once launched warplanes now docked side by side in joint exercises. The same Pacific Ocean that had once burned with gunfire became a shared economic artery, carrying cars, electronics, and culture instead of bombs. In hindsight, the story of Japan's rise and fall from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima was never just about war. It was about the modern world learning for the first time the full cost and potential of industrial civilization. It was about how nations harnessed machines' information and production, and how those same tools could both destroy and rebuild. Yamamoto's fateful words uttered after the attack on Pearl Harbor now echo through history. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right, but not only in the way he intended. The giant he feared was not just America's arsenal or its military resolve. It was the new era itself, an era where knowledge, science, and production would become the true weapons of global power. From the ruins of war, both nations would learn that dominance without understanding is temporary, but mastery of innovation endures.